So he wrote a brief and presented it to the War Labor Board. And the War Labor Board issued a ruling which called for equal pay for equal work in the war plants.
So the purpose was not simply, you might say, a moral idea that women should get equal pay, but if they didn't get equal pay, they would pull down the wages of men.
Precisely.
Correct?
And I think illustrates Walter's larger view.
Yeah. So both combined the principle
Yes.
and also practicality,
Right. And practicality.
of building the union. Now, let's tell a little more about the matter of the empowerment of women. And part of that was to protect the working conditions of men. You want to tell a little bit more about what you were doing to get the empowerment of women?
Well, thank you, Tom, because what we were doing, we had a lot of education classes. In addition to the National Conference on Women, we had regional conferences for women. So women could come together, and of course, was replicated in the 60s and the 70s and 80s, where women said we need to meet together. And we met together because then you could learn parliamentary procedure, conducting Congress. We were interested in women becoming sufficiently knowledgeable about their rights in the union, their rights in the shop, their rights in the community, and so that in order to become empowered, you have to be informed and educated. And then you have to learn to exercise those rights. And that takes a lot of association with each other, agreeing on common goals, so that in the plant they could speak up, they could go to they know what their rights were to go to their committeeman or their shop steward. In the local union, to say, hey, look at us, we're here too. And hopefully, although there wasn't much time for this during the war, but later on, in the community, in politics.
Now, did women get elected to jobs in the union, such as shop steward, officers of the union? How much encouragement was there of that?
Well, it was tough. I would say that in the smaller local unions, women began to be elected as recording secretaries.
Yeah.
Sometimes it was combined secretary-treasurer. We would encourage women to be not only chair of the women's committee, but also education committees, and to participate. You know, so to speak, you have to earn these things. They're not handed to you. And as you always say, a woman has to do twice as well to get half as far as a man.
Yeah. Now, when was Olga Madari said was elected vice president? Do you remember about when that was?
Well, yes, Olga's. That's a very, very interesting period in the UAW. Horace Sheffield and Willoughby Abner, who was a brilliant man from Chicago and very active in the UAW, had been president of the NAACP in Chicago, at a UAW convention. The Horace Sheffield nominated Willoughby Abner for vice president. And this was sort of out of the pale because it was not, the Ruther slate was the slate that was going to win at the convention. But this was a very strong protest with the failure of the UAW to sufficiently recognize blacks across the union, in local unions, and in the international administration.
Walter was president of the UAW.
Walter was president, and it was, I think, a heroic act of Horace Sheffield.
Tell me more. I know you and I both knew Horace Sheffield well. Tell me a little bit more about his background and his relationship to Walter.
Horace passed this last year.
Yes.
In
fact, I was going to do an oral history on him, but go on.
Yeah. I would say that Horace, in many ways, is one of the few persons that I've ever known or worked with in my life who never really compromised his principles. And he, among other things, at this particular time, he formed the Trade Union Leadership Conference, which was an organization of African Americans. So after this convention, I'm struggling to get the year, but come to me. Walter realized that something had to be done about bringing blacks into. Meanwhile, Olga Madar and the women, and I was part of this, were campaigning for a woman on the board. And what Walter did for the next convention, in many ways, I think, illustrates his leadership. You spoke earlier about principle and working things out on a practical basis. He proposed the he proposed to increase the International Union Board, IEB, International Executive Board, by 3 spots. And these would be board members at large. And he named 3 people. Ken Bannon, because Ken was director of the Ford Department and was the only major department that did not have a representative on the board. So that took care of Ford. Jack Edwards, black, and Olga Madar. And then later, these 3 at large were named vice presidents.
And they were part of the Ruther slate when they got elected.
Yes, oh, definitely.
But
Walter persuaded his colleagues
Yeah.
on the board to go along with this. And of course, there was before a convention, there was a huge Ruther caucus,
Yeah.
but also it had been taken out. You know, Walter worked endlessly in going out to the local unions, whether it was for internal politics or whether it was, for example, on the pension program. It was, he worked at least 2 years, and other officers did too, because to get workers to say, for example, the first pension program at Ford was 8 cents instead of in the paycheck, to put it in a pension program. It took a lot of selling, so to speak, a lot of informing and educating.
Abner was nominated by Horace Sheffield, but did not get elected.
He didn't. He withdrew.
He withdrew. There wasn't a roll call
But the statement had been made, and it was a powerful statement.
But that helped build the idea.
Oh,
that resulted in Bannon.
It was a powerful voice.
And Edwards and who was the?
Jack Edwards, and of course.
Yeah, and he was African American.
Jack, oh yes, he was from the Ford Department, and many people thought, as a matter of fact, as I recollect it, Leonard Woodcock's candidate for that was Horace Sheffield.
Yeah.
But because Horace had been such a leader, he paid the price. He was not named.
That's interesting.
Yeah, he paid the price.
The one that's a real creative liberal pays the price.
Yep.
Of building it for somebody else to come along.
But the great thing about Horace was he never became bitter. Yeah. Bitterness is such a debilitating emotion. Horace never was. Yeah. And he was put on Walter's staff.
Yeah, I remember he and Bob Millender were very much for real integration, the sense you and I think of. Is that your memory?
Oh, yes, you're so right, Tom. You're so right.
All right, now let's move along. We're getting into the fair practice and civil rights. I remember looking at Gladys Beckwith's Women's Hall of Fame. There's pictures, you were much younger then, but I think marching in Oakland County or someplace, or Grosse Pointe.
One loves to look at those younger pictures, those photos when one was younger.
Yeah, well, you were active in the civil. You remember about what year that was? I don't need the exact year, but was that part of a UAW activity, or as an individual? What was your role then?
1950s. Well. I can't remember when I wasn't active in the civil rights movement. It really comes from my college days. Just as an individual, this must have been, those marches, of course, were in the late 50s, 60s, because it culminated in the great 1963 Detroit March. And so there were, for example, in Grosse Pointe and Pontiac and other places, there were the demonstrations for, we're doing housing among.
Now, were you working for Vic Ruther at that time or for Walter? Do you remember?
Oh, I was working for Walter then.
All right, then were you encouraged by him to do this, or was this an official UAW function, or what was your relationship